Okay, welcome to Technique Tuesday. This is going to be the part 2 for bass guitar. And we're going to kind of build on what I was talking a lot about last week, especially about how there's a kind of natural progression that you have to understand as a new musician, getting into your instrument and understanding a little bit more about music in regards to harmony and being a part of the rhythm section. And this is important for bass, surely, but not just bass. Honestly, any instrument that I teach on this channel could benefit from understanding this. So we're going to talk about intervals, a couple of different scales, and the blues. The blues we're going to use as a way to start to understand intervals, harmonic analysis, and more. So the blues is a very prolific genre of music. It really has roots in African music, and then the foundation of jazz kind of came along just about at the same time as the classic American blues genre, and some of the biggest artists, probably around the 1920s, 30s, 40s, was when blues really took off in America. And it is a beautiful genre, and it can take many forms, but it is a style of music that has a very specific form to it. So that's why it's going to be useful for us today in starting to kind of understand some of the theory and scales that go along with the blues, and we're going to use the scales and the theory to kind of explain more about intervals, because as I was talking about last week, there's kind of that natural progression of understanding as a new musician that you have to build from your understanding of musical intervals, then going on to scales and understanding triads, and then seventh chords and beyond. So in order to understand the harmony of the blues, it's important that we start to look at what musical intervals are and why they're so important to the construction of a chord. So, for example, with our first chord in this progression, C7 here, this C7 is considered a dominant chord. When I was talking about last week how there's kind of three main categories of classification for different chords in a given song, and how there's either tonic chords, which means chords that kind of sound like home and the center of the key. And then there's subdominant chords, which I guess if I were to put a kind of descriptor on those, they're chords that create interest, usually create some sort of lift or a different, it has a different character than a tonic chord, but it also doesn't usually create a whole ton of tension that a dominant chord would. in a given musical scale, if we're just looking at the major scale, we have 7 steps to a major scale. And the first note or the first chord is a tonic chord. So we'll put a T there. The 2 chord in a major scale, or the second note, but really I'm talking about the chords more so. The 2 chord is a subdominant chord. The 3 chord is another tonic chord, interestingly. And in a major scale, the 1 chord is a major chord. The 2 chord and the 3 chord are minor chords, or minor triads. The 4 chord is the primary subdominant chord. The 5 chord is a dominant chord. Whoa. The 6 chord is another tonic chord. And this relates to the fact that the relative minor is found at the 6th degree. And remember, the relative minor uses the same notes as we have in the major scale, but it would be if we were starting from the 6th degree. So that's why that's kind of a tonic chord. And then the 7 chord, it has aspects of kind of both subdominant and dominant. I think many people would actually probably call it a subdominant, but it has what we call a tritone in it, which is also found in the 5 chord, 5/7 chord technically. So it we'll call it subdominant because it's not technically a full dominant chord, but whatever. It's kind of a bit of a special case. So that's the major scale. In the blues, the functions are pretty similar, but the scale that we use for the blues does not use a natural 7. All of the chords you see are either C7, F7, or G7 here. So they all have what we call dominant function. So it's like playing 3 different dominant chords, which is kind of very different from what we have in the major scale, where we only really have 1 dominant chord. So in the blues, we make our 1 chord dominant. Our 4 chord, which is F, C, D, E, F, is also dominant. And then our 5 chord, the G, is also dominant. So there's an aspect to blues where you would think, well, if they're all dominant chords and we don't really have a tonic, how do we have a home? But when everything is dominant, that to our ears actually kind of makes it all function like they're almost just all major chords. Because at the end of the day, the 7, all we're doing is adding 1 extra note. And if we were looking at these like triads, this has a root, major third, and a perfect fifth. And so does the F7, root, major third, perfect fifth. And the G also has a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth. But what makes these 7 chord, these dominant chords dominant is the flat 7, which we also include in the full 7 chord. So in a C7, we have C as the root, E natural is the major third, G is the perfect fifth, and then B flat is the flat 7. Normally in the C scale we would have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, but like I said, in blues we make that 7 a flat 7, so that's where the B flat comes from. So the way that this chord progression works is that this is what we kind of call standard blues form here. We have a 1 chord, a 4 chord, a 5 chord, and that's it for this standard form. This is a simple blues progression, but this is the form. There are many ways to create even more complex chord progressions and kind of develop this and add different things in order to create even more interest and diversity in the blues. But it's important to understand the bass form before you kind of go off crazy. So one thing that I mentioned in one of the first videos that I did was that it is important for many of our rhythm section instruments in order to be able to read kind of different styles of written music. And this is another style of written music. This is kind of in the form of what we call a lead sheet. Now, a lead sheet gives usually the chord progression and a lot of times the melody. This does not have a melody to it yet, but if it did, we might see the melody instead of all these slash marks. And what these slash marks are in red are kind of like beat holders or place markers. So you'll notice this is a song in 4/4, meaning that we have 4 beats in each measure. So these red marks are marking out 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And as a rhythm section player, it's important to understand a lot of different styles of music and what kind of typically goes along with a style of music, because we might just get a sheet like this with a few chord changes on it and that's it. But the key is usually up in the top left of a given lead sheet, they write the style. It might be pop, rock, or blues. So if this says blues and it just gives us a bunch of slash marks, it's kind of implied that we know what we're doing. So that's kind of the goal to be able to get to today. As a bass player, a lot of times the bass player is going to outline the chord progression in some way. They could just play C, 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 F, 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 C, 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 and just play the roots, but that gets a little boring after a while, and there's ways to create a little bit more interest. And we know that dominant chords have a root, major third, perfect fifth, and a flat 7. The whole thing is wobbling, so my handwriting is getting is a little rough there. But okay. So if that's the structure of a dominant chord, And all of the chords that we have here on this progression are dominant chords. All we would have to do is change which root we're starting from, and there's a common pattern that we can kind of start to be able to play as we go along our chord progression. And a lot of that is based off of two different types of, well, four different types of scales, depending on if we're in major or minor. And right at the bottom, just make sure you can see this, we have the major pentatonic, minor pentatonic, major blues, and the minor blues scales. And all of these numbers here are the scale degrees that we include in these given scales. The first ones that we're going to talk about are the major and minor pentatonic. This is an example of a major blues, what we have up here, because we're using all dominant chords, and all of our chords have a major third. What you're going to realize is that chords are primarily defined by their third, the type of third that they have, and the type of seven, if there is one. So major third and a flat seven automatically kind of tells me that it's a dominant chord. If it were a major third and a natural seven, that's more of what we call a major seven chord. And if it was a minor third and a flat seven, that's what we consider a minor seven chord. So the third and the seventh of any chord is going to really kind of define the tonal and harmonic qualities of whatever chord we're looking at. So when, as a bass player, we go to play along with this C7, one very common technique in the blues is to make a arpeggio with the notes that are in the chord. So we kind of outline the chord by playing each note one at a time. And that's kind of what an arpeggio is. Instead of playing all the notes at the same time and having a chord, an arpeggio breaks it up and you play one note at a time. But in order to figure out what notes we can include and stuff, we got to know a couple of these different scales. So because this is a major blues, we're going to mainly focus on the major pentatonic and the major blues for this progression. But I'll talk a little bit about the minor and minor blues maybe towards the end. But in a major pentatonic scale, there are 5 notes, not 7 like a major scale. But the scale degrees that we use are the 1 or the root, the second note, third note, fifth note, and the 6th note. And I'm just going to play that scale really quick on the bass here. This is going to be a C major pentatonic scale, just so you can hear what the sound is like. And a good way to kind of remember pentatonic, or the reason why we call it a pentatonic scale is because it's a scale with 5 notes as opposed to 7. So there is your major pentatonic, and many people have heard that scale or licks or riffs using that scale. The reason why I'm talking about the major pentatonic is because of this 6th degree here, which is not naturally in the major blues scale. That's why I kind of put it in parentheses over here. But the major blues scale is very similar to the major pentatonic scale, but it also includes this chromatic note of the flat third. So now I'm going to play the C major blues scale. So this is... Oh, maybe I put the parentheses around the wrong note. So the sixth degree is actually usually included in the major blues scale. My bad. But the flat 7 is not usually included, but it can definitely be included. So let me play that again. Major blues scale. Okay, so that scale has 6 notes. The 1, 2, flat 3, 3, 5, and 6, and then it goes back to 1, usually. But you can kind of remember that because all of our dominant chords have a flat 7 in there, we can also kind of include that in our arpeggio and walking bass line that we're about to build. So when we go, the first 4 measures of a standard major blues progression are on the 1 chord. So we would play something very similar to what I just did. But the most common, I guess, arpeggiated or walking bass line that we hear in a major blues song from the bass player includes the root, the third, the fifth, the sixth, and the flat 7. So you may have heard something like this before. Whoa. Okay, and if I were to do that 4 times, or maybe actually, just because of the amount of beats that takes, maybe we do it just twice. So because we're going up and down the scale, in order to be able to fit all of those notes, we really only go through that kind of progression twice, and that takes up our 4 measures. Then we would go to the 4 chord. So this is going to start from an F, and in that case, our major third is going to be A, our perfect fifth is going to be C, and our flat 7 is an E flat. This is what kind of makes the harmony for blues very interesting, because normally we wouldn't have a song that has an E natural in the C7 and then it changes to an E flat as the flat 7 degree of the F7. So very interesting, but it works. So I'm going to play, we've got 4 measures of C and then 2 measures of F, and we're going to hear that same type of walking bass line that I had, but we're only going to play it once because that's going to take up our 2 measures, and then we have to go back to C. So we got... There we go. Then we would come back to C and do the same thing. Just once this time, because we only have 2 measures here. When we get over to the 9th and 10th bar of our progression, we only have 1 measure to work with. So if we only have 4 beats, we can't really do our full sequence of going 1, 3, 5, 6, flat 7, 6, 5, 3, 1. We only really have time for doing 1, 3, 5, 3, or you can do 1, 3, 5, 1, but that's kind of it. So I'm going to play the 2 measures from C, and then we're going to get into the G and the F7. So... So right there, we only had the root, major third, perfect fifth, major third, then we go to the F, root, major third, fifth, major third, and then we would come back, finish it off with a C7. And then we're back to the beginning. What is very characteristic of the blues is that it's typically known as what we call, this is a 12-bar blues. And it's kind of unique in that our chord progression lasts 12 bars before it repeats back over again. Normally, you would have progressions that either repeat every 4 bars, 8 bars, or even 16 bars. So this, being a 12-bar progression, is it's kind of unique and characteristic to the blues. And this is really called a 12-bar blues, major blues. So that kind of covers, we got major pentatonic, major blues. And if this were a minor blues, we actually wouldn't use dominant chords at all. It's kind of crazy how different it is. But in a minor blues, this C7 would actually become a C minor or a C minor 7. And all of our chords would actually be minor. But the form of having... Where'd my pen go? The form of having the 1 chord for 4 bars, and then the 4 chord for 2 bars, 1 chord for another 2 bars, the 5 chord, the 4 chord, and the 1 chord, that form stays the same. So we would really just change the 7s in order to be some sort of minor chord, either just a regular minor chord or a minor 7 chord. A regular minor chord would just have the notes that are in a minor triad, so a root, minor third, and a perfect fifth. But if we had a C minor 7, that would also include a flat 7 as well. So it would be root, minor third, perfect fifth, and a flat 7. So we also have a pentatonic scale for the minor. The minor pentatonic scale, this has a kind of a much different sound compared to our major pentatonic. It has a root, flat 3, the 4, 5, and a flat 7. And then we come back to the root again. Probably heard that before too. And again, the minor pentatonic has very similar intervals to the minor blues. And what is also another primary characteristic of blues music is including what they call blue notes. And those are kind of notes that are not necessarily in the typical major or minor scales that are associated with normal major and minor music. So these notes in red, that flat 3, the flat 3 or a minor third is not usually included in major music because we have a major third usually. So this is what we call a chromatic note in between the second and third degree that is kind of also known as a blue note. And it just kind of refers to a note that's not usually in our major or minor scale. So it adds chromaticism, which is when we have notes played one after another that are only a half step apart. So when we go from the 2 to the flat 3 to the 3, those are notes that are all just 1 fret apart on our bass. And that flat 3 is kind of the blue note of the major blues scale. And the minor blues scale has a blue note as well, but it's in a different position between the fourth degree of our scale and the fifth degree of our scale. So this is a minor blues scale. So very interesting sound there. Right, it's not a note that is in our scale, but it is that's a tritone interval right there. If we're just playing the root and the sharp 4 there, that's a tritone. And a tritone is normally considered a flat 5. But if you remember what enharmonic equivalents are, a flat 5 is actually the same thing as a sharp 4. And this, again, has chromaticism in it, with 3 notes that are just 1 fret apart from each other on the bass. And that sharp 4 is kind of the blue note of the minor blues scale. So being able to understand all the different scale degrees and how we use these scale degrees and intervals in order to construct a bass line, this is why intervals are so important. We need to know exactly which intervals make up all these different types of chords, whether it's a dominant 7 chord, a minor 7 chord like we use in the minor blues a lot, or even a major 7 chord, and there's plenty more. But in blues, the two most common ones that two most common 7th chords that we run into are either dominant 7 chords or minor 7 chords. So that's a little bit about being able to construct these different bass lines that we have as we play through a typical 12-bar blues. But now I'm going to show a little bit about being able to play all this stuff on the bass. So one second. All right, that will work. Okay, so what I was just playing there on a C7, C, the note C is found on the 3rd fret of our A string, which is the 2nd string from the top as I look at the bass. So if we cover the 3rd fret, this is a C. One thing that you'll realize about the bass and the guitar is that we can find the same exact pitch in multiple locations. So there's not necessarily only one way to play these arpeggios, but one of the more simple ways to be able to play these different intervals is by using multiple strings. But first, I'm going to kind of show how we just find the major 3rd from our root C. So in order to find a major 3rd interval on the bass and on the piano, on the guitar, is by going up 4 half steps from the root. So if our root is on the 3rd fret, we would go up 4th fret, 5th fret, 6th fret, and 7th fret. This is on the same string. So from C, if we go to the 7th fret of the same string, there is our major 3rd. When we're at the major 3rd, in order to get to the 5th, we would go up 3 more half steps. So we're on fret 7. If we went up to fret 10, there is our perfect fifth. And our 6th degree, from going from the 5 to the 6 in our arpeggio, we would go up another 2 frets to the 12th fret. And then our flat 7 would be the 13th fret. Right. And that's if we were playing everything on the same string. It's not really advisable to do that. We have multiple strings for a reason, so we might as well use them. So one way to play that same arpeggio is by starting with the same C, and we go up 4 frets to the 7th fret of the same string for our major third. But we can also find our fifth always 1 string up and 2 frets above whatever our root is. So we go a string up and up 2 frets as well. So that'll be the 5th fret of our D string. And our 6th degree would be also on this D string, the 7th fret. And then we can use the 8th fret to get up to our flat 7 and back down. So that's a second way to play that. But this third way that I'm about to show you is probably my favorite because you don't really have to move your hand very much. It's a very economical way of playing this same thing. So we can always find a major third interval if we go up 1 string and back 1 fret. So these, if we start on our C and go up a string and back 1 fret to the 2nd fret of the D string, that is also the note E and also a major third. Then we would go up 3 frets on the D string to the 5th fret to get to our perfect fifth. And we can also find our 6th degree if we go up another string and we would go to the 2nd fret of that top G string there. So from C, we can always find a major 6th interval, or the 6th degree of our major scale, 2 strings above and 1 fret back. So we have root, major third on the string above, 1 fret back, 5th on that same that same string there on the 5th fret. Then we go up another string and play the 2nd fret in this case, and then just up to the 3rd fret of that top string and back down. And you can see how much more efficient or economical this way of playing the arpeggio is. A lot better than that. So the crazy thing, especially about bass, is once we kind of know these rules and how to find these different intervals, all we got to do is change the root that we're starting from, and these patterns are going to stay basically almost the same. So if we do our C7 arpeggio, like we've been doing, when we go to the F, that is the 3rd fret of the D string. So it's just a string above, and also the 3rd fret. And in this case, we're not going to be able to do my favorite arpeggio shape, but it's very similar. So we would be able to if we went up to this F, but at some point we kind of just run out of strings to be able to use, right? The arpeggio shape that I like to use uses 3 strings, but if we're already on the second highest string, we don't have that third string to be able to finish our arpeggio. So in this case, when we start on the F, that is on the 3rd fret of the D string, we can do the same first 3 notes the same way we did the C7 arpeggio. So we go F on the 3rd fret of the D string, then we go up a string, back a fret to find the major 3rd, then go up 3 frets to the 5th fret, and there's our perfect 5th. So the exact same structure for the first 3 notes, but in order to get to our 6 and 7, we can't go up another string, so we would go to fret 7 and fret 8 of our top string. And that is what we would play over the F7. And then for the G7, we would just slide up 2 frets from F, and there's our G7. And if you remember, normally that 5-7 or the G7 only gets 1 measure, or is only played for 1 measure. So this is when we normally just do the root, major 3rd, and perfect 5th. Root, major 3rd, so the root is on the 5th string of the D string, or 5th fret of the D string, and our major 3rd is on the 4th fret of the top G string, and the 5th is on the 7th fret of that top string. Then we go back 2 frets in order to find our F7 again, and this time we would only play the root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, back to the major 3rd, and then we go back to our original C7. And that is the full progression. So, like I said, we can just be staring at a bunch of slash marks, and if somebody writes blues up on the top of the page, we got to kind of know what we're doing. Now you know what you're doing. And it has roots in the pentatonic scale, but it really is using either the major blues scale or the minor blues scale. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to cover. I don't think so. But this is a way of being able to play a technically kind of like a walking bass line or an arpeggiated bass line that uses more intervals than just the roots. Right? A lot of people might think that the bass player really just plays the roots of the chords, but that is really not the case at all. The bass player also has the freedom to be able to play many more notes that are in our scales or in the chord structure itself as the song goes along. So this is just one way to kind of create a more interesting bass line, and this hopefully helped you understand a lot of these different scale degrees and the intervals of like the major 3rd, a perfect 5th, a flat 7, and to be able to start to find some of those on your instrument. Next week, I'm going to be doing the vocal part 2, or voice part 2. And I have an amazing song picked out. And we're going to look at the chord progression of that as well as the melody. And we're going to talk even more about intervals and how they relate to how a melody relates to a chord progression and some of the artistic choices that this artist made as they were constructing that song. So I'm going to play it, sing it, and then we're going to analyze a lot about the song. So looking forward to that already. Excited for that one. So hopefully you learned something, and I will see you next week, hopefully.